Betty Radis's translation of these letters has sold over than 2 lakh copies since its publication in 1974. It is by far the most widely read book on Abelard and Alios in the English speaking world. The proviso English speaking is important. The English was peripheral to Abelard's own milieu. He deliberately identified himself with the France and in particular with Paris, which represented for him the capital of France and the center of culture. As writers, he and Alios have been famous in France at least since the publication of Jean Demune's version of Roman de la Rose in early 1280s, which praised Alios and quoted from her first letter. French enthusiasm for them remained very much alive, and it is perhaps undergoing a revival. In 1996, Professor Jake Werger published a new authoritative account for the general reader. Jean Jolivier did the same for Abelard's theology. A novel by Antony entitled echoing the final words of the Elios's first letter, Farewell, My Only Love, was published in 2000 as an opera. Ahmed Essays suggests that theatre musical in 2001. This Persian theatre was an appropriate location to remember Abelard and Alios as the Chetu and was fortified grade which gave him access to the heart of Paris, where their own drama has been portrayed 9 centuries earlier. Students came to Abelard from all over Latin Christendom, and he described how he considered himself the greatest philosopher in the world. He knew nothing about China or India, and very little about Islam or Byzantium. His world wasn't famous, confined to Catholic or Romanesque Europe, which regarded itself as the successor of the old Roman Empire. Through this cultural inheritance from the Middle Ages, European liberals of the 18th and 19th century identified with Abelard and Alios as follows: 3 spirits confronting persecutions and prejudices. They were regarded as martyrs for the love and heroes in the struggle against the Catholic Church. As models of the enlightened society, Abelard was seen as the champion of the reason opposing superstition. This point is very, very significant, where we have to find out that he is fighting against superstition and he is championing the cause of scientific temperament. So Abelard was seen as a champion of the reason. So reason versus superstition. Reason is overpowering superstition, while Alois was understood as challenge to the doctrine of celibacy upon which the power of Catholic clergy depended. She was also perceived as a proto-feminist who opposed patriarchy by contradicting Abelard and ridiculing the pretensions of monk. So that is what, there are a number of things which we find where Alios is represented as she's opposing patriarchy, and even she's a prototype of feminist. I mean, she's talking about her own task, and she's representing herself in her own self. Throughout much of the Western Europe, Abelard and Alios remained household name among educated people, particularly liberals, well into the first half of the 12th century, as version of the letters has been translated into principal European languages. Their dilemma were comprehensible and interesting to anyone with Christian education, whether Catholic or Protestant. Catholic could be shocked or inspired by the irreverence of Abelard and Alios towards ecclesiastical authority, while Protestant deplored the cruelty with which the Roman Church had treated them. Celibacy was one of the most significant aspects of Catholic Roman religion, and when Abelard he could not practice as a monk, as a celibate, he was castrated. So this is the inhuman treatment done by Catholicism, which is why most of the critics oppose this and criticizes. Catholics could be shocked or inspired by irreverence of Abelard and Alios towards ecclesiastical authority, while Protestants deplored the cruelty with which Roman Church had treated them. The prestige of Abelard and Heloise as upstanding liberals made it way to the United States of America, the archetypal land of the freedom and opportunity for Europe in the 19th century, when the new state of Illinois, 1818, recruited immigrants to populate Chicago. It advertised the city by declaring that her men are all like Abelard and her women like Heloise. So when the new state of Illinois, 1818, recruited immigrants to populate Chicago, it advertised the city by declaring that her men are all like Abelard and her women like Heloise. This form of Heloise's name conveniently rhymed with Illinois. In return, rich American made the pilgrim to Paris to put flowers to the neo-Gothic tomb of Abelard and Heloise in Père Lachaise cemetery, according to Mark Twain, writing under his real name of Samuel Clements in his travel book Innocents Abroad, and their tombs were more revered and more widely known than any other Christian tomb save that for Saviour himself. By contrast with all this, the popular reputation of Abelard and Heloise dwindled in latter half of the 20th century, especially in the English-speaking world, almost in aversion ratio to the volume of scholarship concerning them and number of students engaged with the humanities. France is obvious exception to this rule because French national field still identifies with Abelard and Heloise as famous French people. It is the success of Betty Redis's translation of the letters in the face of growing apathy and ignorance which makes her achievement so significant. Without her work, knowledge of the Abelard and Heloise in English-speaking world might be dwindled to minuscule proportion. The letters would of course have continued to be known to experts in 12th century scholasticism and modernism, but they would no longer have been access to the wider public. The story of Abelard and Heloise had been sustained in 1930s and 40s through the success of Helen Waddell's novel Peter Abelard. This is a very attractive book to any expert on Abelard and Heloise because it is steep in the original sources. However, in quotations from the Latin and theological rigors no longer appeal to the young, the Chateau and Winders in 1971 rescued Eddie MacLeod's biography of Heloise, which had sold so well, and it was first published in 1938. It failed to make into paperback. Similarly, Regan Parnaud's Heloise and Abelard, which sold widely in France, was limited to hardbook when published in English translation by Collins in 1973. Explanations can only be speculative for the current decline in knowledge of Abelard and Heloise among the English-speaking educated public. The decline in didactic religion education is probably one cause. Catholic Christians are no longer taught the theology of celibacy, and some Protestants have turned to multiculturalism instead of attacking the Pope. Furthermore, the agonized sexual morality of Abelard and Heloise become difficult for a new generation to understand, as contraception is routine and abortion is argued to be women's right. Abelard and Heloise are in danger of no longer being seen as liberal icons or martyrs for love, but the ludicrous figure who could not get the grip on their lives. So far from being courageous of the principle, they look like a solipsist who dramatize their own grotesque predicament. After centuries of fame, time is at least threatening to affect the memory of Abelard and Heloise. The honored dead who are commemorated at New Cemetery now include commanders of 1870, the soldiers of 2 world wars, Oscar Wilde and Jim Morrison. So it is understandable that visitors only occasionally now lay flowers on the tomb of Abelard and Heloise at the entrance. Betty Redis opens her introduction with the generalization of most popular have heard of Abelard and Heloise as a pair of lovers as famous as Dante and Beatrice or Roman de la Rose. This revealed the generation to which Redis belonged, as many as educated people now will not have heard of Dante and Beatrice, though they still know Romeo and Juliet. In 1935, Cole Porter had indeed coupled Abelard and Heloise with Romeo and Juliet as free spirit as his popular song, Just One of Those Things. Similarly, with Dante and Beatrice, the pre-Raphaelite had idealized them as icon of the pure love. Reproduction of the romanticized portraits of the couple were still common in the first half of 20th century. For the generations of students in 1960, however, who have been educated neither in the Bible nor the Latin classic, the letter of Abelard and Aelius can't have immediate appeal. Today's students know of the Middle Ages and the time of Robin Hood, King Arthur, and Harry Potter's Hogwarts Castle. Despite the dramatic content and focus on sex and violence, the letter of Abelard and Aelius, with their form, structure, and classical term of reference, do not readily fit into the fairy story view of the past. Nevertheless, the continued success of Radis's translation of the letter over the past 25 years and more showed that she did succeed in producing a modern text with appeal to readers. At the end of the introduction, she explained why she rejected the literal but archaic style of her predecessor C.K. Scott Moncrieff. He was the translator of the Proust, an extraordinarily good translation, but he chose for Abelard and Aelius an archaic style which is almost impossible to read, though it renders to Latin very accurately. The objection to Scott's Moncrieff translation of 1925 is that given the impression of Abelard and Aelius old-fashioned pedants, a member of some peculiar sect. A continuation modern elements which Radis introduced into her translation is the distinction between personal letters and letters of direction. None of the manuscripts suggest any such direction, nor is there any break in the correspondence between letter 5 and 6. Radis derived these terms from J.T. Muckle's edition of the Personal Letters 1953 and Enid MacLeod biography of Aelius, which distinguishes love letters from letters of direction. There is indeed a crucial turning point in the correspondence at the beginning of the letter 6, which Aelius sees being concerned with herself and asks Abelard, on behalf of all her nuns, to counsel and direct them, which he duly does in letters 7 and 8. Radis' distinction between personal and letter of direction remains a useful one, however, as long as it is understood to be an additional explanation and not the work of Abelard and Aelius. Henceforward, in her extant correspondence at least, Aelius always wrote to Abelard as the founder of her convent and not as her special lovers. She may also have written more personal letters to him, but these have not been preserved. For example, she would have wanted to reply to his heart-rending confession of faith, page number 211 to 12, which was addressed to her and published by his student Berengar of Poitiers at the time of his condemnation. But she may have been just too unwise to record any reply to him, as that might embroil both her and her nuns in accusation of heresy. Instead, she relied on the power of Peter the Venerable, abbot of Cluny. Though he did not help her as much as he might have, she had to remind him to send her a written absolution to the hang on Abelard's tomb, and he was not enthusiastic about helping Astrolabe, the son of Abelard and Aelius. The greatest threat to the reputation of Abelard and Aelius over the past 30 years has come from allegations of forgery. Betty Radis underestimated these in her introduction in 1974, though she had obtained a copy of wide-ranging allegations made by John F. Benton at the International Conference at Cluny, 1971. She discussed Benton's argument only in a footnote because she thought from ill-founded, as indeed they were on his own later admission. But she had no way of foreseeing the popularity of the forgery theory in America. It has monumented of its own, particularly among the academics and their students, from whom question of disputed authorship and literary theory were the staple subject of the seminars. For furthers, Benton won the support of the leading experts, Giles Constable at Harvard University, who in his survey of medieval letters and letters collection 1976 agreed that the most celebrated exchange of the love letters in medieval ages as Abelard and Aelius may not be authentic. Radis pointed out that Charlotte Carrier in 1933 had questioned the authenticity of the letters. Those of Heloise has been challenged, in particular because she made such religious statements. How could any medieval woman, let her alone a nun, has said such thing? The editor of the Latin text, J. T. Muckle, concluded that Heloise's first two letters had been forged, at least reworked, because Heloise would not have desired to leave such a character sketch of herself to posterity. Benton went further that this predecessors, as he denied authenticity of the letter, Heloise's Historia Calamitatum, as well as the subsequent letters, where Historia Calamitatum has always been assumed to be the genuine autobiography, that a crucial document in the study of Abelard. Benton concluded the letter 1, the large part of 12th century fiction, and Heloise's letter had been composed in the 13th century. His purpose in arguing for forgery, like that of Muckle, who was Catholic priest who was controvert and conventional picture of Abelard and Heloise is liberal, opposed to the authority of the Catholic Church. Benton and Muckle thought this anarchist. It was in misrepresentation of Abelard and Heloise dedicated lives as member of the monastic order. Heloise had been fulsomely praised by Peter the Venerable, abbot of Cluny, which she would not have been, according to the anti-liberal argument, if she had written the shocking letter attributed to her. Eliminating letter 1, Historia Calamitatum, and other letters of Abelard and Heloise from their literary corpus cuts the protagonists down to size and make them more like another monks and nuns of their time. Abelard's academic writing on the logic and theology survive in relatively abundance, as does his poetry in religion form of hymn and liturgical laments. Similarly, Heloise documents as a base of the convent of Paraclete. Similarly, Heloise is documented as a base of the convent of the Paraclete and as a correspondent of Peter the Venerable. She was also praised as a composer and a poet by huge metal. This material is conflicted to the intellectual religious sphere, as is usual in medieval sources. These are the kind of things which clerics thought it appropriate to record. There is a little personal information in this. We are not told that Abelard and Heloise, though thought about themselves, still less what they felt. By contrast, it is expression of their emotion which makes the allegedly forged letters of Abelard and Heloise so unusual and so precious. Abelard begins Historia Calamitatum with an appeal to human feelings, and Heloise likewise opens his first letter to him with description of her wounded feeling. It is because the letters of Abelard and Heloise address the emotion so deliberately, they arouse such strong reaction of antagonism or enthusiasm in their reader, as rhetorical works in continuous Latin tradition, stretching back to Cicero. This is exactly what they were intended to do. By eliminating all 8 letters, Benton aimed to record a more truthful conception of Abelard and Heloise than that of the 19th century liberal stereotypes. We could now judge them, he argued, by standard which they themselves would have considered valid. Henceforwards, they could be seen in more positive terms. Heloise as a dutiful nun and Abelard as a respectable college professor. We can strike from the historical record, Benton wrote, the image of Abelard as calculating seducer and the arrogant of ungrateful student who could dismiss Anselm of Leon as sterile and obfuscating teacher years after the death of that great scholar. This was wishful thinking as Benton part, however, as Abelard's contemporaries Fulk and Duel and Rosalind described him as seducer, and Otto of Freishing confirmed that mocked Anselm of Leon. Much of the controversy about Abelard and Heloise arose from how we choose to characterize them. Ultimately, this runs the not technical point of scholarship but on individual readers' reaction to what the source say. there will never be agreement about them because there was no agreement at time. What Abelard, Golith, as Saint Bernard described him. Saint Bernard described him as Goliath, the lord of misrule, or was the Christ philosopher, as Peter the Venerable describes him. Who was Heloise intellectually independent or dependent on Abelard? The numerous scholars have assumed, or did she have mind of her own? An epithet of her not known to Redis declared that she was Abelard's equal in feeling, conduct and intellect, and then adds that she was without equal in her knowledge of literature. This implies that she was Abelard's superior in this respect. Heloise's level of education and knowledge can only be inferred from her letters. Judging from them, it is possible that she did have a better grounding in Latin classic than Abelard, and had specialized in logic as distinct from literature from boyhood. In 1980s, Benton withdraws his allegations that letter one Historia Calamitatum was mainly a work of fiction, admitting that this argument not been vindicated, but he did not abandon the theory of forgery as such, since he retreated to a fallback positions where Abelard, because the author of the letter of Heloise, the hypothesis remained consistent with this aim of that Abelard and Heloise in more positive terms, and it means that Abelards put words into Heloise's mouth in order to exemplify repentance and monastic peace. Since John Benton death in 1988, his position has been maintained by Chrysogonus Wedel. The entire correspondence from which the pen of single writer. There is one sole author of the work. This author is Abelard. This is in no way excluded and participation of Heloise, since the presentation of theme and exchange of the ideas set forth in the letter probably corresponded to actual discussion between them. This idea of joint literacy project between Abelard and Heloise had been first put forward by the Latinist Peter von Moon in 1980. In 1988, David Luscombe in the lecture in British Academy brought together the argument as they stood. The problem we are left with, many may never dispel, is that of the knowing whether the letters were at first written for dispatched separately or successively, and each provoking reply and further correspondence with until Abelard and Heloise requested in full, whether the collections arose from compact to share, compose and exchange their thoughts, experience and principles in fictive correspondence. In the latter case, Abelard and Heloise may be said to have forged the correspondence themselves, as Luscombe adds. The boundary between fact and fiction, between reality and art, is not from either the case or can't be certainly drawn. The forgery debate, which Benton has reopened in 1972, is form of historical facts about Abelard's life and about the transmission of the manuscripts, and spread over in 1980s into the broad postmodern question: what distinguishes history from literature? The letter of Abelard and Heloise have been revalidated in factual terms. There are no anachronism in them. Benton had initially alleged, nevertheless, they are not necessarily true, as any piece of writing is an artifice. Autobiography in particular has to be literature as much as history. Abelard and Heloise were not even writing in their mother tongue, but in learned language, and a language of demanding rhetorical tradition. Abelard did not frame Historia Calamitatum as straightforward account of the facts of his life, because there was no mood for that in Latin literature he knew. It purports to be a letter to a friend who is in a fellow monk, but to this day it is impossible to say whether the friend is literary fiction or a real person who has still to be identified. In other words, Historia Calamitatum contains elements of fiction and ambiguity from its opening words addressed to Abelard's friend. Now the debate comes whether these letters are written by a single author or not, and this debate is generated. We find this introduction of M.T. Clenchy, in which he's debating this, a single author for all the letters. Ultimately, there is a question mark, but let's just discuss. The reason why Benton and Wedel and other argued that so far at least no one has succeeded in isolating stylistic traits and incontrovertible distinguish the letters of Abelard those alios. Furthermore, they both made use of the same stock of quotations. If there were not single author, there must be at least have been an editor who made the letters into the book. Redis slipped up when she insisted that there seems no reason to suppose that Alios edited the personal letters in any way. On the contrary, someone has edited the letters of Alios is the most likely candidate. If not, then we have to presume a third party did it, and that makes us back into the argument that forgery. In arguing that Abelard wrote all the letters, Benton worked on the premise that when Abelard and Alios both use the same quotations, the initiative invariables come from the Abelard. This is what the textual evidence suggests. Since some of the quotations in the letters are also found in Abelard's theological work, but Benton did not consider the possibility of many of these ideas and perhaps quotations also. Abelard's theological work derived from Alios, and that she could therefore have been initiator of the letters. If in letters of Abelard and Alios the one sole author work, in other words, as suggested by Weddell, Waddell, that the author is more likely to have been Alios and Abelard. At the convent of the Paraclete, she had the writing facilities, stability, time and knowledge and the motive to write, whereas Abelard was repeatedly on the move and engaged in a series of public controversies, which eliminated to his second trial in hearsay and council of Saints in 1140 to 1141. For what it is worth, the manuscript edition of the letter also suggested that Alios rather than Abelard was their editor as author. They were associated with the convent of the Paraclete. Now you remember the name of the convent of the Paraclete, and the video which I am uploading, you will find the pictures of convent of Paraclete as well, and with the Paris or Cluny. Abelard saw him in the last decades of his life, but the manuscript edition in itself shaky, and all controversies about the authorities of the letters originated from this. There are no letters of Abelard and Alios in the sense of actual document written or sealed by them. There is no incontrovertible autograph writing of either of them at all. The letters existed only as a copies made up in book form, and earliest book of this sort dates from 1280. Remember, this is what the time 1280, more than 150 years after events they concern. Redis points out these facts in themselves do not prove nor even suggest that the correspondence is a forgery, or medieval letters were not usually kept any more than modern ones are. The only sorts of the letters routinely preserved for posterity in the 12th century were the charters documenting the property of monastic houses. In addition to that, exceptionally successful monks like Saint Bernard and Peter the Venerable had copied of the letters preserved in book form and spiritual readings for their successors. It is such monastic context that the letters of the Abelard and Alios are made presumed to have been made up to the book, and the convent of the Paraclete, because they formed part of the foundation history of the convent. But his first 12th century copy of the letters has not been preserved, or never actually existed if we accept the forgery argument. All we have now are the copies of the beginning around 1280, which are associated by Jean de Meun, who is credited with translating the letters into French and publishing them in Paris. Therefore, thenceforward, the letters entered the literary canon, and they were enjoyed by Petrarch and other intellectuals in the 14th and 15th century. As Jean de Meun was undoubtedly the publicizer of the letters, and there is no evidence of their existence before his time, no writers refer to them before 1280. Hubert Sylvester gave renewed life to the forgery controversy in 1985 by arguing that Jean himself was their author. The hypothesis that the merit of the naming or the writer might have been capable of such a imaginative feat, where Benton had never been convincing as specific about the motive of his unnamed forgers. On other hand, Sylvesters insisted that Historia Calamitatum contained anachronism and mistakes, and this is not the case. The argument for the Jean authorship is weakened, since it is hard to see how he could have been accurate about the many details of Abelard's life so long after his death. The failure of the Benton's attempt to show that letter, Historia Calamitatum, is a forgery had reinforced the authenticity of the letter collection as a whole, since all the manuscripts start with its make and others' letter depends on it. Sylvester wanted Jean de Meun to be the author of the letter so that he could demonstrate that Heloise has been a good Catholic and who has never written words of Abelard about being a harlot of an unbeliever. Just as Benton wanted Abelard to be responsible college professor, Sylvester wanted Heloise to be an obedient old-fashioned nun like his fellow Catholic priest J.T. Muckle. Sylvester cites Peter the Venerable, letter of the Heloise, and irrefutable evidence that Peter would have never been. Sylvester's view they are incompatible with morality in Christian doctrine. Whether Heloise was in fact a proud pagan who derived her moral views from Cynes and Roman Stoic rather than the Christ and his saint is question which will continue to debate as long as the letters are read. There will always be difference of opinion about whether the medieval ages were without exception or age of faith. It is impossible to be certain that Peter the Venerable knew about Heloise's innermost thought. He probably knew more than the letter suggested, as Abbot of Cluny controlled hundreds of monasteries across Latin Christendom. He headed a large intelligence gathering network in Europe. Sylvester presumed that there is irrefutable evidence that he would have condemned Heloise if it has but immortal and no factual. So there is a lot of debate which is generated by M.T. Clenchy, and the debate is going on whether the letters are written by one writer or many. The identity of Heloise. In 1990s, the spotlight shifted from Abelard to Heloise. This was signaled by Barbara Newman's article 1992 entitled Authority, Authenticity and the Repression of Heloise, which argued that she did indeed compose the letters to Abelard, and furthermore, she came to Abelard with not only her mind but her imagination already well stocked. This refers to Abelard's description in letter 1, Historia Calamitatum, of how, even before he knew her, her literary knowledge has already made her most renowned throughout the realm of France. Page 10. A rare but revealed landscape readers miss the force of the Latin superlative. A most renowned is her translation made the weaker statement that Heloise's knowledge had won her renown. This minor mistake reinforces Newman's argument that the reputation of Heloise has tended to get slighted by scholar, whether male or female, because the medieval woman intellectual is so unfamiliar a phenomena. Peter the Venerable likewise commented on Heloise's extraordinary fame and added that she could not be distracted from her usual plan to learn the art. For that literary achievements had Heloise won such a preoccupied knowledge. Peter the Venerable drew attention to her musical composition. Years' skill sent new term of melody to very ears of the god. A huge medal in his letter to the likewise began with her music, sing praise to the Lord or harp, and a symbol, your fame flying sounding through the voice, has resounded with us in medieval astronomical theory and through the space via the harmonies made by the crystal sphere which hold the stars in place. By this means, Hughes explained, Heloise's fame had reached him, his fellow canons for far away. In border of the France and Germany, you have surpassed the female sex how by composing prose, by the verifying new constructions, and by renewing family words. These descriptions refer to later period in Heloise's life. Of none of them is conclusive proof of her real fame, and authors of an X or grin. Historia Calamitatum, Abelard wanted to show that Heloise was a good enough match for him. The greatest philosopher in the world would team up with the most brilliant woman in France. Peter the Venerable may have praised her so flawlessly because he wanted to draw her and her nuns into the Cluniac sphere of the influence as against Saint Bernard Christian. In fact, Heloise adopted Christian's liturgical practice at the convent of the Paraclete. And for huge metal, it was that ally of the St. Bernard's persistent self-publicist who has attacked Abelard as a heroic on the basis of the little evidence. Nevertheless, these testimonies, despite their bias, do suggest that Heloise was famed for her mastery of Latin and her originality in composing prose, verse, and music. The epithet of her stating that she was unequal to in the knowledge of all literature. She was so renowned among intellectuals, at least, composing of hers in both oral and written form must have circulated widely in France and beyond France, as well as according to Huge Metal. Of her earliest work, which established her reputation before Abelard knew her, no information now survive. What sort of things might have publicized her outstanding knowledge of the classical literature? Two additional letters by Heloise has survived. They emanated from the manuscripts independent of the art and convent of the Paraclete. One is to Peter the Venerable, that is page number 224, and the other to Abelard. The letter lacked its salutation and validation, and it was not translated by Radis, though she noted its description of the Abelard loved by many, but most clearly loved by us. The letter introduced what Heloise calls the baby questions about passage in the Bible of the Abelard, to answer which he duly does, often to length. Much of his work looks simplistic and it might have been ignored had it not been by Heloise and Abelard. For example, Annette MacLeod in her biography and Heloise pick out questions. Question number: what does it mean when St. Paul says pray without ceasing? To which Abelard replies, never neglect a moment when we should pray. In fact, Heloise was alluding her to profound problem when the literal interpretation of the scripture, St. Paul's word, cannot be taken literally, as there would be no time for sleep and essential need. This is why Abelard explains St. Paul only mean those time when we should be praying. In commenting on these questions of Heloise, MacLeod says they offer notable evidence both of how attentively she was accustomed to read and of the profound critical attitude, largely the result, no doubt, Abelard influence. MacLeod, no doubt, is revealing there is no evidence that the Heloise derives her critical attitude from Abelard. On the contrary, it is more likely that she was to her mind, and her mind already well stocked. MacLeod underestimate the Heloise's ability to comparable with likewise from 1930s that ideas about the love derived probably through Abelard. It is not surprising that debate have continued over the centuries about the letters of Abelard and Heloise. Not that new idea can emerge more than 800 years after their death. He has always been a controversial figure and she is rapidly becoming one. Perhaps he was St. Bernard, a man dissimilar even from himself. So we cannot say that anything is characteristic or uncharacteristic of him. He gave his great collection of citations from the Church Father an enigmatic title, Yes and No. It prologue began. Amidst such great mass of the words, some of the statements even of the saints note seem to differ from each other but actually contradict one another. The bibliography of the Abelard and Heloise has become comparably massive and bewildering, particularly because of the range of the speculations about the identification and authenticity of their letters. And ultimately, these are questions that experts cannot answer or decisive proof in the form of individual letters. For Heloise, the issue was clear and unequivocal. However difficult it is for us to follow her. Conventional morality would speak of a young woman who is willing to live in sin with a man so as not to stand in his path, as such as sacrificing herself. But for her living wholly for Abelard is self-realization. Abelard was by torn with an impossible conflict between his desire for Heloise and all the jealous possessiveness which went with it, and his belief that this duty was to realize himself as a philosopher and to preserve his intention towards that ideal. It has been pointed out that the quotations used by Heloise all appear in a work of his own, book of his Theologia Christiana, written after They parted but several years before letter 1. And we have already gone that letter 1 is his history of calamity. It certainly seems likely to that he filled in the outlines of his argument with a reference to the chapter and verse when he wrote his account for circulation. But there is no suggestion that he did not accept their validity, but simply refused to be persuaded. Perhaps it was too much to accept for an ardent lover and a proud and hypersensitive man. But at last he saw that her attempts to persuade or dissuade me were making no impression on my foolish obstinacy, and she could not bear to offend me. So, amidst deep sigh and tears, she ended in these words: "We shall both be destroyed. All that is left us is suffering as great as our love has been. In this, as the whole world knows, she knows herself a true prophet." Page 16. Heloise never reproached Abelard for secrecy of marriage, which to her must have seemed an act of hypocrisy and another betrayal of the ideal. She was even ready to lie on the Abelard's behalf and deny it with Fulbert's broke his promise and spread the news. Years later, however, in a bitter moment, she pointed out that the irony of the fact that they had been spared when guilty of the fornication, but punished through a marriage which you believe had made amends all previous wrongs doings. Page 66. There were furtive meetings followed by the scenes of Fulbert, which made Abelard decided to remove her from her uncle's house. The convent at Argenteuil, where she had spent her childhood, was the obvious place to take her, and it was near enough Paris from further meeting to be fairly easy. We know that Abelard could not keep away. He argues in one of his letter page number 8, that they were more justly punished for their conduct when marriage than for everything they did before, because of their sacrilege in making love in a corner of the convent of Refractory, the only place where they could snatch a moment together alone. What he had in mind when he made his wear a prostitut's habit, no one can know, unless it was to give greater protection from the Fulbert, but it was a disastrous thing to do. She could have stayed indefinitely with the nuns without it, and Fulbert very naturally assumed that Abelard was trying to get rid of her by making her a nun. This was the immediate cause of his horrible revenge. His kinship got into Abelard's room at night and castrated him. This is a very significant event in the life of Abelard, although it is very painful. Long afterwards, Abelard could write of this to Heloise with a hint sign as an act of God's mercy which rid him of the personal dilemma along with the torments of the flesh. But in letter 1, and listen carefully, but in letter 1, what he vividly recalled is the pain and horror, his urge to escape and hide from the noisy sympathy of the crowd outside and the outcry of this pupil pushing into his room. His feelings of humiliation and disgust at being a eunuch, the unclean beast of Jewish law. He admits that it was shame and confusion in my remorse and misery rather than any devout wish of conversion, which brought me to seek shelter in a monastery cloister. His entry into the Abbey of Saint Denis, and this Saint Denis is in Paris, and it's a huge structure. You could actually see its pictures and geographic location. Must have been hurried on quickly, and the period of the novitiate entirely waived. For Abelard says that his wound was scarcely healed when the clerks clamoring for him to continue his teaching from the cloister. He accepted the challenge, by far the best thing he could have done for teaching. For teaching took him out of retirement, which was unsuited to his temperament, and enabled him to get back that of the eager, questioning young minds. He emerged from the crisis still a perfectionist and uncompromising challenges of belief and practices which he judged to full sort of truth and honesty, and now single-minded in his purpose and whatever his original motives were for entering the religious life. There is no reason to doubt that his subsequent conversion was completely sincere. In his way, Abelard was as firm an upholder of the faith and purity of the monastic life as Saint Bernard, and to the end of this day he spoke out against the shortcomings of the church wherever he detected them. He remained a dedicated humanist and a scholar, seeing that he could use his knowledge of Greek philosophy to lead his pupil on the true philosophy. As the greater origin had gone, there was a general interest among 12th century scholars in Origen's work through Latin translations, and Abelard has a close personal feeling for the Origen, also a eunuch, though self-inflicted. He draws the comparison explicitly in the letter to Heloise, page 82. Abelard's continued interest in the Greek philosophy was one of the charges against him by Saint Bernard, who said that Abelard proves himself a pagan by attempting to turn Plato into a Christian. The Historia Calamitatum is a personal record of his life between his entry into St. Denis about 1118 as his conclusion sometime after 1132. So we can simply say that the Historia Calamitatum is a record of 1118 to 1132. It is not necessary here to recapitulate in detail all the tribulations, quarrels with the unreformed monk of St. Denis, a persecution by his old rivals and enemies leading to the condemnation at the Council of Session about 1121, further troubled at St. Denis and his flight a Champagne, retirement to a hermitage near Troyes, to which his students following him and built the oratory he named Paraclete. He was certainly greatly helped and sustained by a devotion of his young people and by the knowledge that his gift as a teacher were unimpaired by calamity and what he saw his jealousy of his contemporaries. But he is so vague when writing about his continued danger and apprehensions of further charge or of hearsay that one wonders if he was developing a persecution complex. There must have been some foundation of his fears. At one point he seriously considered abandoning Christendom to seek refuge in Islamic. Instead he accepted invitation perhaps in 1126 to be abbot of the remote monastery of St. Gildas de Ruyas on the west coast of Brittany. This time he could hardly have made a worse decision according to Abelard. The monks were not only idle and dissolute but murderous in intent when he tried to reform them and felt himself isolated among illiterate savages. And I quote, "I used to weep as I thought of wretched, useless life I led, as profitless to myself as to the others. I had once done so much for the clerks, and now all I did for them and for the monks was equally fruitless. I had proved ineffective in all my attempts and undertakings, so that now, above all men, I justly merited the approach. There is the man who started to build and could not finish." Page number 34 to 35. He was tormented especially by the thought that oratory of the Paraclete was deserted and neglected. It was not until 1129 that he heard that Sugar, who had become abbot St. Denis in 1122 and was engaged in active and controversial reforms, had got documented establishing the abbey's claim to the convent of Argenteuil and had expelled the nuns. Heloise was already a prioress, and this is the first mention of her since she took her vows some 9 years before. She had taken them at his command and with no sense of vocation. As Abelard very well knew, she had had about 18 months with him and was probably in her 20s when she renounced any hope of further life outside the convent walls. Abelard says that she had refused to listen to those who in pity for her youth tried to dissuade her from submitting to the yoke of monastic rule as a penance too hard to bear. She had wept and quoted from Lucan, Stoic Roman poet whose works they both knew. Carolina's last words before her suicide after the death of her husband Pompey. So saying, she hurried to the altar, quickly took up, almost snatched the veil, blessed by the bishop, and publicly bound herself to the religious life. Her mood was not one of the Christian hope but of the tragic despair. Abelard says nothing about her admission being a hurried and irregular as his own, and record only the bare fact that she took her vows before he did. From her letters we learn that this hurt and offended her more than anything, and that the memory still rankles for years. Had he been afraid that she would turn back like Lot's wife, she saw it as sign of mistrust, though he knew that she would have followed him to the flames of hell. She may be guessed, and rightly, that jealousy, possessiveness prompted Abelard in this as in the secret marriage. It is only from reference in her letters that we know anything at all about life as a nun in Argenteuil. And these are painful readings. Abelard was changed man, physically and spiritually. She was not changed. She felt no vocation for convent life and was tormented by frustrated sexual love. The pleasures of the lovers which we shared have been too sweet. They cannot displease me and can scarcely shift from my memory. Wherever I turn, they are always there before my eyes, bringing with them awakened longing and fantasies which will not even let me sleep. Any meetings they had had after his mutilation to arrange her hurried reception into the convent had been impersonal, and very probably in the presence of none. In first letter she reproached him for giving her no sympathy, no support in person or by letter. Yet though she evidently did not pretend to herself that love of God had supplanted love of Abelard, and her good brains and strong characters must have saved her from going to peace. She would have socially standing as the niece of a canon, but she would not have been chosen to be prioress of a convent unless her outward behavior had been scrupulously correct. The prioress stood second to the abbess and had many responsibilities, one being the education of the nuns in novices and children brought up in convent as Heloise had been herself. Abelard writes defensively in answer to her reproach that he had not thought it necessary to write a letter of advice or sympathy, knowing her good sense. God's grace, her bestowed on all essential to enable you to instruct the earrings, comfort the weak and encourage the faint-hearted, both by word and example. Indeed, you have been doing since you first held the office of prioress under your abbess. The difference between the convent, monastery, abbess, abbot, prior and prioress. Let's understand the difference. The convent are also known as monastery. They are known as monastic people and convent. And abbess, it is also known as abbot, or prior, also known as prioress. So prior and abbess could be the head of the monastery or the church. It was monastic custom when a church dignitary or benefactor died to inscribe the news of his death and eulogy of his life on a parchment roll, which a monk would then take round the monastic house. Each of these would inscribe its full title and promises to pray for the departed, often with a request for similar prayers for members of its own community. The roll of the Blessed Vital contains the names of the 207 religious houses in France and England, and Saint Mary of Argenteuil being the 14th. Beneath the title on the left is a Latin poem, while the convention formulate a prayer are rather squeezed on its right. There are other poems on the roll. 4 of them may by convents of nuns, but this is written in correct Latin elegies, though the sentiments are not original in any way, and handwriting is clear and well formed. It has therefore been supposed that this is the work and written of Heloise herself, and she would not have been interested when she had not already been prioress. This is very significant, where we find the evidence of Heloise's writing. And I repeat, there are other poems on the roll, 4 of them by convent of nuns. And we remember here that she is the convent of nun. Heloise is the convent of nun right now. But this is written in the correct Latin elegies, though the sentiments are not original in any way, but the handwriting is clear and well formed. It has therefore been supposed that this is the work and writings of Heloise herself, and she would not have been interested with a hand had she had already been prioress. Abelard travelled from St. Gildas to make arrangements to hand over Paracletes to Heloise and some of the dispossessed nuns who stayed together, and there they met after a separation of 10 years. Abbot Sugar had made no provision at all for the nuns, and Historia Calamitatum record briefly that at first they suffered great hardship. The buildings could not have been more than a small church of wood or stone, which the students had built to replace Abelard's original chapel, and the primitive cells they had occupied, and women were dependent on what they could get out of streams and fields, helped out by gifted from the neighborhood, which were generous when their plight was known. In 1131, Pope Innocent II visited Auxerre and granted a charter to the abbess Heloise, confirming the nuns' possession of the gift they had received and any subsequent gift in perpetuity. There were further meetings on all the impersonal basis on the letter show that letter 1 record that at first local opinion criticizes Abelard for not doing enough for the nuns, and then when he visited them more often, there were malicious gossip about his former relationship with Heloise and the fact that he still seems to unable to keep him away from her. It seems likely that he was absent from St. Gildas for some time, for he had installed them in Paraclete in 1129. We know that in January 1131, during Innocent II progress from France, Abelard was present at the last gathering in the Benedictine Abbey of Moringhi near Itames, where the Pope consecrated the high altar. He had gone to ask for the papal legates to be sent to St. Gildas for its reform, but for the first time perhaps he met St. Bernard. The January between St. Gildas and the Paraclete was some 360 miles, would take 10 to 14 days, so he would hardly have travelled to and fro. He had indeed cherished hopes for finding a haven of peace with the sister, but the last pages of the Historia shows that he is back at St. Gildas, feeling himself an outcast and wanderer like Cain, and he is recovering from painful fracture after fall from his horses, and had narrowly escaped from attempts to murder him by poison and ambush, and sees no prospect and improvement in his position. The Historia Calamitatum was evidently written in 1132 or soon after. Heloise says in her first letter that by chance someone brought it to her. If it was genuine personal letter of consolation to the unnamed friend and fellow monk, as Abelard says, one wonders why it went further than him. It seems more probable that Abelard intended for the circulation. There may have been more than one copy in order to win sympathy for the predicament and to pave the way for release from St. Gildas, so that he could return to his true vocation of teaching. He was still remembered for this in the account of his meeting with Bernard, and he is described as monk and abbot, and so himself monastic order and most distinguished master of the school, to which flocked to the scholars of almost all Latin world. It is known that he left St. Gildas with the bishop's consent and right to retain his rank of abbot, and that was reaching in Paris in 1136, Mont Saint Genevieve, when John of Salisbury heard him lecture on dialectic, though he left Paris before John did. Perhaps this was only temporary. There are no other dates or indications of the whereabouts until 1140 and 1141, the Council of Sens, but it is probable that most of the time he was in near Paris and teaching, for this is the period of the greatest mental activity and output. At first sight to Historia Calamitatum, look at as if written by a self-centered, though not intensive man whose youthful years were ruled by self-assertion, pride and ambition. On reflection, one sees it more on an attempt to put on record from the detached standpoint the fact of life which he writes, believe that he often been misjudged and was now at risk. It also been said that the writing of this letter became the act of a catharsis that turned what might have been merely an apology into a true self-revelation. In this sense, the Historia is a search for identity and a personal autobiography comparable with those of St. Augustine, Celine, St. Teresa, and Ruth. Heloise's reaction in her first letter, and that is letter number 2, are dismay at his misfortune, the details of which are unlikely to have reached her before, and horror at the idea of his life being in danger at St. Gildas. She then points out that if he can write a long letter of consolation to the friends, he can also write to advise and encourage the community at Paraclete as his duty as their founder. He is wasting time on monks such as described, but would find her nuns receptive. He can also write to her, to whom he had a personal obligation. For 12 years or more, she had brooded over his apparent indifference in never giving her a word of recognition for the sacrifice she made in entering monastic life. He knows very well that this she did not only for love of him, but his neglect, and forced her to the conclusion that what he had felt for her was no more than lust. When physical desire had gone, any warmth of affection had gone with him. She virtually demanded the letter of explanation from him and in her right. In letter number 3, Abelard defends himself on the charge of negligence. He had not supposed that Heloise any longer had need of him. Could he really have thought that? No one can be sure, but it can't be dismissed as simple wishful thinking. Disgust with its mutilated person may have made his want to shut the past out of his mind. He was changed, and knowing she was prioress and now abbess, he may have been all too ready to believe that she was changed too. And his own conversion had at some point been sincere and permanent, so that he was now dedicated to God. The tone of his letter is set by the superscription. He writes as abbot to abbess. If the community is anxious for his safety, he says, they would remember the power of prayers. She must know that the sacrament of the marriage would bind them, as well as the integrity of our faith and our profession of the same religion. Page 59. Increases the effectiveness of our own prayers. I think one should not see this as selfish refusal to be drawn on Abelard's part, but more an attempt to put the relationship on a different basis, because he knew this was in her best interest. But he certainly does not allow himself to enter imaginatively into Heloise's plight, and this prompts her to be more explicit. Letter number 4, she writes of her sexual frustration and inability to forget their happiness as lovers. She puts her dilemma clearly. She took vows not to love for God, but for love of Abelard. Taking vows means that she ought to be nun in the true sense, and that her life should be ruled by love of God. But now, how she was possible when she loved him alone? She is perpetually conscious of being a hypocrite for whom, when she would admire her pity, it sees only her outward behavior, and it means nothing to her. The intentions is all, and the intentions is lacking. She looks for a reward only from Abelard, and wants denied it to her. She can hope for nothing but God, for she has denied him, and she cannot repent. And I quote, how can it be called repentance for sins, however great the mortification of the flesh? If the mind will retain, it will sin, and is for fire with its oldest desire, page 68, unquote. She explores his help in resolving an intolerable situation. This is a terrible picture of the soul in agony and of the total human love which was brought only suffering. It is painful to contemplate how such intensity of feeling had been stoically concealed from the outside world for years of the young woman left. It is characteristics of Heloise that she never compromises and never wavers from the moral view she shared Abelard, that of the ethic of intention. Her keen intellect can analyze herself, her problem clearly, but the feeling behind the word of passionate and painful, that afford jolts Abelard out of any suspected complacency. Her replies at length, especially on the point of your old perpetual complaints against gods concerning the manner of our entry into religious life and the cruelty of act of treachery performed on me. The epithet repeated later implied that he had heard it before. The only time would have been when they met between his mutilation and taking the veil. He sounds irritated by her taking it up and with perhaps that it reading too much into his words. He will not recall the past with nostalgia as she does, but at least she shows that he had not forgotten. He reminds her of certain events, their mockery of God when she dresses as nun to go to Brittany, overwhelming desire which led them to make love during the seasons of the passion or in refectory at Argentine. But it tries to make her see them episodes which recall just punishment for God rather than for an act of God mercy which freed from both from flesh which can be only barrier to divine love. He begs her to make a supreme effort to shake for bitterness and resentment and think only of the love of Christ. It was he who truly loved you, not I, my love, which brought us both to sin, should be called lust, not love. You say, I suffered for you, but he suffered truly for our salvation and your behalf of his own free will. She must see herself as chosen to be the bridge of Christ, and knows by surmounting her bodily suffering she can win an martyr crown which can never be his. Of where there is no battle, there is no victory. All the time he is trying to make her see the whole story of their relationship from its start until their entry into religion from the Christian monastic point of view, knowing that they were at least agreed in believing that chastity was something higher than wedlock. The letter ends with a prayer, and though parted on earth, they may be forever united in heaven. Heloise replies in letter 6 with great dignity. First paragraph of letter mark the turning point of the correspondence. She will not argue nor trouble him further with heart searching. She knows she now asks only for his help in occupying their mind with more constructive thoughts. We are never to know if she was able to achieve a chance change of heart and reorientation of herself towards time. The healer would make the physical severance and Abelard less acutely felt. One hoped that she found compensation in her service to the Paraclete. Perhaps later on she came to feel that this was a true form of devotion to God and more than outward work under a cloak of hypocritical pity, as everyone who was written about her and wanted to think. Meanwhile, she asked on behalf of community for information about the origin of the order of nun and for advice on a rule suitable for women. Remembering what had gone before, we can only admire Heloise, resolute her self-control and equal her intellectual and practical ability. She has lived under the Benedictine rule for at least 14 years, observing it in sense from the outside. With her intelligence and erudition, she is well equipped to offer criticism of what seems to her unsuitable if the rule is to apply to women. She can appreciate that Saint Benedict was willing to temper her rule to meet men's capacity to observe and suggest that women should not have too great demand made upon their physique. She also argued cogently that many details of the observance can be categorized as outward work and are unimportant to in comparison with feigning spiritual intent. Accordingly, she asked for guidance and questions such as manual labor, fasting, clothing and diet, as well as for suitable arrangements for the divine office and for the reading of the gospel at night. that emphasized throughout his own reasonable demand, avoidance of extreme and sincerity intent. It is better to promise what is incapable of doing and then to break down under impossible demands. She would have no longer noviated a deeper personal commitment and truly spiritual training. She wants a poorer and simpler life, difference perhaps the one she has known to Argentile, for she sees that those who are true Christian are wholly occupied with the inner man, but they have little or no concern for the outer man. Abelard replies with two long treatises, letters 7 and 8, one to answer Heloise's question about religious communities of the women, the other a detailed rule for the observance at Paraclete. There is so little written about women's orders that this is a document of intrinsic interest of the convent life at this time, though it is not very well expressed nor logical in its arrangement, and despite its elaborate formal opening it breaks off with curious abruptness. It combines long passage of sermonizing and erudition with a down-to-earth approach to practical detail. The nuns are to be sensibly dressed in an underwear and habit which hangs clear to the dust, with a full change of clothing and necessary sanitary protection, to wear proper stockings and shoes, and to have adequate beddings. Dirty hands and knives are not to be wiped on bread intended for the poor, to spare the tablecloth. There is to be no self-imposed fasting, no undue mortification of the flesh, and no cutting down of horses of sleep, or the nuns will not be mentally alert for their prayers or the studies. There is a characteristic emphasis on education. Routine practical tasks are to be assigned to nuns with no aptitude for the letters, but any nun with the ability to learn must be taught to read and write. As far as possible, we should worship God with understanding, a statement which Abelard amplifies into an attack on current illiteracy in monasteries. This letter seems to be the basis of a later set of rules which were preserved in a manuscript at the Paraclete and were intended for the use of Mother Foundation and the daughters' houses. 6 of the letters were set up in the Heloise's lifetime, and the rather later rules has been thought to be by her, but it can't be firmly dated. It differs from Abelard's recommendations in the certain essential and a few less important points. There is no provision for the male superior ruling a double monastery such as his advocates, but the abbess is to have authority over the monk and lay monks serving the convent, and nuns are not strictly cloistered but may go outside the convent for necessary business. The blankets and the pillows he specific are not mentioned, and the nuns appear to sleep fully clothed instead of their shifts as he wants. They may also eat pure wheat bread, whereas he makes a point of 1/3 of the flour being of the coarse grain. There are minor modifications, but a great deal has been read into words of if they are translated as in a refractory, our meals are vegetables without meat. This was accord with strict monastic practice, but directly contravened the founder's ruling that meat may be eaten 3 times a week, and he expresses view that nothing except excess is forbidden. But if the words mean the meatless meals consist of vegetable, is simply a reference to what Abelard goes on to say about the days when no meat is to be taken. These long letters of direction, as they are called here, written in the rather stiff formal style of contemporary scholarship, are also vital for an understanding of Abelard and Heloise. They provide the necessary depth of background to their relationship and show how this developed in the only way possible to them. In a sense of Heloise had won her point, she has forced Abelard to look at her problem honestly and to renew contact with her. Though not in a way the first hoped, Abelard has sincerely tried to show her that the only love which can now unite them is love of God, and God has acted mercifully towards them. Abelard wrote a long letters addressed to the nuns on the importance of study and urged them to apply themselves in Hebrew. To this he twice referred to Heloise as having known knowledge of Greek and Hebrew as well as Latin, and surprising statements is Abelard himself showed no knowledge of Hebrew apart from occasional word and had little or no Greek. And though Peter the Venerable has admired her learning and gift for logic when he was a young man, no one else has said she knew any Hebrew except the monk William Godel. Writing in 1173, she probably had enough Greek for liturgical purpose. Heloise wrote a short letter in which she, Abelard's love by many but most clearly loved by us, to accompany what are known as problems of Heloise, 42 difficulties of interpretations in scripture, to each of which Abelard gives carefully reasoned answers. Her request for hymns for the use of none is lost, but his answer accompanying the first batch he wrote give the gist of it and shows how they now wrote to each other. There are relatively few tributes to Abelard after his death, either as theologian or philosopher. People would remember or hear of events at saints who knew little or nothing of Abelard's last months at Cluny, and Bernard's influence was strong enough for Abelard's name to be virtually erased even if his theological teachings continued in the cathedral school where Bernard's traditionalism was not acceptable. The analytical and critical methods of the non influenced such famous theological manuals as Peter the Lombard Book of the Sentences, and Abelard stand as one of the creators of the open-minded thinking which led to the birth of the medieval universities. But as a logician he suffered from the discovery of the Aristotle's scientific work within a decade of his death. Once Aristotle's solutions to the nature of universal was known, Abelard's formulations of the conceptualism, which was remarkably Aristotelian, was no longer read. There are, however, manuscripts of his logical works as his Apologia, which date back to the late 20th and early 30th century, as well as reference to his teachings. The case of the latter is very different. The occasional reference we have to be lovers in the 12th century chronicles or short and factual. William Godel, monk of Saint Modin of Limoges, writing in 1173, says that Heloise or Heloise was formerly Abelard's wife and truly his friend, and a religious and learned woman well versed in both Latin and Hebrew. And apological elegiacal poems highlighting Abelard's struggle with Bernard depicts Heloise as searching for him in this time of crisis. From the early 13th century, the Chronicles of Tours describes how Abelard had built the Paraclete and installed the nuns were with his former wife Heloise as abbess. How she, who was truly his lover, and his body brought there for burial and prayed constantly for him after his death, and then adds, it is said that when she was lying in her last illness, she gave instructions that she was dead and she would be laid in the tomb of her husband. And when her dead body was carried to the opened tomb, her husband, who had died long before, raised his arms to recover her, and so eclipsed her closely in the embrace. None of these 9 new manuscripts of the letters can be dated before the late 13th century and earlier, 150 years after the letters were written. There is no trace of an independent manuscripts of letters. 1. Historia Calamitatum, a copy of which Heloise herself, page number 47, says came into her husband's. Jean de Meun must have had a manuscript when he translated the Historia and introduced the story of Abelard and Heloise into 64 lines of his continuation of the allegorical Roman de la Rose about 1280. It seems probable, as both J. Monfrin and R.W. Southern has suggested that the letters were kept by Heloise at the Paraclete, and that more than a century after her death they were brought to Paris and copied. It would be unlikely that anyone would know of her self-revelations during her lifetime. Peter the Venerable would hardly have thought so highly of her holiness and sense of occasion. He had read of her sensual longings and self-reproach by hypocrisies. There seems no reason for support that Heloise edited the personal letters in any way. Even if we accept that Abelard may have put words into her mouth in the Historia Calamitatum, my own feeling is that once she had accepted that her relationship with Abelard must be re-established on a different basis, and that henceforth she would look to him only for guidance as the founder of the institutions which she was a respected abbess, she would be unwilling to read these painful outpourings of her heart from the first paragraph of letter 6, and correspondence takes on a different tone from which Heloise never waves. What became the Abelard's copies of letter no one can know. It was a current practice for medieval writers to keep copies of their own letters and even to revise them from a later circulation as a letter collection. This would be of the general interest as showing the learning and expertise in the art of letter writing of a single individual, such as Saint Bernard, Peter the Venerable, or John of Salisbury, and its importance would be literary rather than historical, with the young Pliny or Sidonius Apollinaris as model for variety of content and elegance of the style. It was unusual for answer to be included. They could disturb the literary unity of collection. Here is a further indication that the letters were not issued either in Heloise's lifetime or letters as literary letter collection, but for their intrinsic personal interest when they came to light in the later 13th century. Even after Jean de Meun, reference remains scanty. Abelard and Heloise are not among the incontinent lovers in the second circle of the Dante's Inferno, Canto 5, though their story has something in the common which that of Paolo and Francesca's da Rimini. Chaucer does not more than mention Heloise, that was a base net for a prayer in the Wife of Bath's prologue, line number 677 to 678. You remember this in Chaucer's prologue also, line number 677 and 678, where he's talking about the wife of Bath prologue about Heloise, where she is one of the deadly assorted company in a satire on matrimony. Had probably knew of her though Roman de la Rose. The first genuine interest in the lovers was shown by Petrarch, one of the 9th God manuscripts dating from the early 19th century, belonged to him, and to the marginal letter note in the Historia Calamitatum, and the personal letters are believed to be in his hand. It is certainly understandable that the author of the Secretum and of his own intensely personal letters should have read the manuscripts closely. About in century 1461, Francois Villon included these lines in his Ballade de Dames de Temps Judis, his theme being the death is inevitable for all mankind. Whereas these learned by Lady Heloise, for those Shakespeare Abelard was first castrated, then become the monk of Saint Denis. It was through love that he suffered such misfortune, but there are last years shown. But this amounts so little, especially at a time when romance like that of Tristan and Iseult or Occasion or Nicolette were highly popular, that it seems likely that Abelard and Heloise could not fitted into the current ideal of courtly love, with its emphasis on the lover's devotion to the chaste and unattainable lady. Abelard and Heloise speaks a different language of the sensuous frankness and a pagan realism in love and classical stoic fortitude in adversity. Their relationship found physical expression, and Heloise is neither cold nor remote, but loving and generous, eager to give service and not to demand it. By contrast with the cruel reality of the tragedy, courtly love as depicted in the in the romance of chivalry appear mannered and artificial. The Latin text of the letter of the Abelard's major works was printed for the first time in Paris 1616 in two practical identical editions, one of the Francois Amboise of other and Henri Duchess. Why there were two editions has never been explained. The introductory material in the two differs, but the text is the same, and the note on the latter one by Duchess appear. Both this text remained standard for over 2 centuries. In 1718, Richard Rawlinson brought out in London a new edition of the letter which added nothing to the edition of 1616, and in 1841 John Caspar Aureli of Zurich published in Historia and the fourth person letter that was followed in 1849 by the Victor cousin Peter Abelard opera in 2 volumes published in Paris, which became the standard edition. It included a Duchess notes and text in based on admonish plus cousin's reading of the 4 manuscripts. It is generally considered a better text than of the J.P. Megane and volume 178 of his Patrologia Latina 1855, though this too is mainly the Amboise's text and then the Duchess note. Today the best edition of the purpose of the citation is by Eric Hicks, La Via et les Epistres Pieris Abelard at Heloise se fame, Paris and Geneva 1991. This print Latin text of the letters 1 to 7 with numbered lines is parallel with the French translation attributed to Jane de Meun. Letter 8, Abelard's Rule for Heloise and her Nun, has been edited by T.P. McLaughlin. Abelard's Rule for Religious Women, Medieval State Studies, 1956, without numbered lines. At your urgent request, my sister Heloise, once dear to me in the world, now dearest in Christ, I have written what are called hymns in Greek, Tehillim in Hebrew. When you and the sisters of your holy profession kept begging me to write these, I asked your purpose in doing so, for I thought it superfluous me to compose new hymn when you had plenty of existing ones, and it seems almost sacrilegious for new hymns by sinners to rank as high or higher than the ancient hymns and saints. I received several different answers. Among them is this reasonable argument of your own. We know you said that the Latin Church in general and the French Church in particular follows customary uses rather than authority as regarded both psalm and hymns. We still do not know for the certain who was the author of the translation of the Psalter which our first French church uses. If we want to reach the decision on the basis of the word of the variant translation, we still say be a long way from universally accepted interpretations, and in my opinion this will carry no weight of authority. Customary practices has no longer prevailed that although we have St. Jerome's corrected text for the rest of the scriptures and translations of the Psalter, which we use so much, is of the doubtful authority. Moreover, the hymns we use now are in considerable confusion. They are never or rarely distinguished by titles and name of the authors, and even when they appear to have the definite authors, whom Hilary and Ambrose are considered the best, and next to the Prudentius and several others, the words are often so irregular in section that it is hardly possible to fit them to the music, and without this there is no hymn at all, according to the definition that it is praise of God with songs. You went on to say that the several of these spheres had no hymn of their own, and of the innocents and evangelists, for example, of those the saintly women who had been neither virgin nor martyrs, and there were also some feasts during which these who sang the hymn could not be truthful, either because these did not fit the occasion, because the false material has been inserted. The letter continues with a detailed discussion of the certain hymns and ends, and so as you beg this of me, bridges or handmaids of the Christ, in my turn I beg you through your prayers to relieve my soldiers and burden of you laid on them, so that the sower and the reaper of this harvest may rejoice in their work altogether. There are 113 extant Latin hymns by Abelard, evidently sent to the Paraclete in three batches, and second to which sword accompanying three addresses to the whole community, as well as some fine verse laments. The most famous of these are included in the volume, page number 230 to 35, Vespers, Saturday evening. How mighty are the Sabbaths and God's Friday, the third nocturne, and the other which our first French church uses. If we want to reach the decision on the basis of the word of the variant translation, we still say be a long way from universally accepted interpretations, and in my opinion this will carry no weight of authority. Customary practices has no longer prevailed that although we have St. Jerome's corrected text for the rest of the scriptures and translations of the Psalter, which we use so much, is of the doubtful authority. Moreover, the hymns we use now are in considerable confusion. They are never or rarely distinguished by titles and name of the authors, and even when they appear to have the definite authors, whom Hilary and Ambrose are considered the best, and next to the Prudentius and several others, the words are often so irregular in section that it is hardly possible to fit them to the music, and without this there is no hymn at all, according to the definition that it is praise of God with songs. You went on to say that the several of these spheres had no hymn of their own, and of the innocents and evangelists, for example, of those the saintly women who had been neither virgin nor martyrs, and there were also some feasts during which these who sang the hymn could not be truthful, either because these did not fit the occasion, because the false material has been inserted. The letter continues with a detailed discussion of the certain hymns and ends, and so as you beg this of me, bridges or handmaids of the Christ, in my turn I beg you through your prayers to relieve my soldiers and burden of you laid on them, so that the sower and the reaper of this harvest may rejoice in their work altogether. There are 113 extant Latin hymns by Abelard, evidently sent to the Paraclete in three batches, and second to which sword accompanying three addresses to the whole community, as well as some fine verse laments. The most famous of these are included in the volume, page number 230 to 35, Vespers, Saturday evening. How mighty are the Sabbaths and God's Friday, the third nocturne, and the alone to sacrifice thou goest, Lord. Abelard also writes 34 short sermons for the Paraclete, which were evidently sent with the following accompanying letter. I recently completed at your request a little book of him, or a sequence, Heloise, my sister, whom I love and revered in Christ's name, and then you ask me hasten to write as best I could, for it is not the kind of the writing that I am used to do. Several short sermons for you and your spiritual daughters gathered together in our oratory. As I was concerned with the written rather than the spoken words, I concentrated on clarity of exposition, nor eloquence of style, literal sense rather than elaborate rhetoric, and it may be that plain words instead of rhetorical speech will be easiest for simple minds to understand, as being more direct. Moreover, for the type of the person who will be listening, or the simplicity and ordinary speech will seems like elegant refrain, and will have a pleasant taste suitable for the girls of limited understanding. In writing, or rather arrange these, I have kept to the order of the feast of the church, beginning with the start of our random farewell in the Lord. You who are in the handmaid ones clear to me in the word, and dearest one in the flesh, my wife, now in spirit my sister, and in profession of the sacred purpose my consort. This shows a side of Abelard we have not seen before. The page number 230 to 35, Vespers, Saturday evening. How mighty are the Sabbaths and God's Friday, the third nocturne, and the alone to sacrifice thou goest, Lord. Abelard also writes 34 short sermons for the Paraclete, which were evidently sent with the following accompanying letter. I recently completed at your request a little book of him, or a sequence, Heloise, my sister, whom I love and revered in Christ's name, and then you ask me hasten to write as best I could, for it is not the kind of the writing that I am used to do. Several short sermons for you and your spiritual daughters gathered together in our oratory. As I was concerned with the written rather than the spoken words, I concentrated on clarity of exposition, nor eloquence of style, literal sense rather than elaborate rhetoric, and it may be that plain words instead of rhetorical speech will be easiest for simple minds to understand, as being more direct. Moreover, for the type of the person who will be listening, or the simplicity and ordinary speech will seems like elegant refrain, and will have a pleasant taste suitable for the girls of limited understanding. In writing, or rather arrange these, I have kept to the order of the feast of the church, beginning with the start of our random farewell in the Lord. You who are in the handmaid ones clear to me in the word, and dearest one in the flesh, my wife, now in spirit, my sister, and in profession of the sacred purpose, my consort. This shows a side of Abelard we have not seen before. Considerate, self-effacing, and patience with the young. What he offers the nuns, he seems. This shows a side of Abelard we have not seen before. Considerate, self-effacing, and patience with the young. What he offers the nuns, he seems decidedly more practical than advice to study Hebrew and Greek. It was also Heloise's request that he wrote to Hexameron, a contemporary, on the 6th days of the creation, and this too is now generally thought to have been written during the 1130s. Whether Abelard ever visited the convent or the Paraclete again is not known, but as also writing for the nuns are introduced by the letter to Heloise, it seems probable that they did not meet again. Apart from the bare fact that John Salisbury heard him lecture in Paris in 1136, nothing is recorded for his movement until his confrontation with Bernard in 1140 or 1141. But as he was attacked then mainly for the corrupting influence of his theological teaching, it sounds that though he was mainly with his students in Paris. Bernard was born 1990s and entered the Cistercian foundation of Citeaux in 1112. In 1115, he was chosen to be the abbot of the new foundation at Clairvaux, which at the end of his life, his 1153, was famous throughout Europe with the 68 daughters' houses. Most monastic foundations hitherto had been based on the rule of Saint Benedict of about 530, and the Cistercians preached the rule of the last dot. But they also looked to the asceticism of the early fathers of the Egyptian desert. The return to the past was prompted by the desire to free themselves from the fetters of the customary practice and the increasingly elaborating liturgy in order to live simple life and thereby gain true spiritual freedom for mediations on the love of God. Many of the Benedictine house at that time belonged to the congregations of the Cluny, and from 1122 Cluny had its own outstanding leader in the presence of Peter the Venerable. One of his most famous letters is addressed to Bernard, and as a reasoned defense of the Cluniac way of life and its interpretations of the rule according to the spirit rather than letter. But as Bernard permitted nothing either to the individual or to the community which could distract from extract demands of the Cistercian life, it follows that he was opposed to knowledge for its own sake and to any disinterested pursuit of learning as it a hindrance to the quest for perfection. Teaching in a Cistercian monastery was confined to its member, starting from the moti novitiate, and its purpose was salvation. The clash between Abelard and Bernard was a cause of the 12th century and is in part instance of the rivalry between two opposing systems of teaching and traditional monastic instruction in the cloister and the greater freedom of the cathedral school. It rests still more on the conflicting temperament of the two men, and tragedy is that they certain things in common. Abelard, no less than Bernard, criticism, insincerity, corruption, and worldliness in the church. He is uncompromising with the license he allegedly found at St. Denis, as with the flagrant immorality at St. Gildas. He had Alois exchange comments on precipitated entry into the monastic life without proper preparation. That is in page number 100. Elaborate monastic building and luxurious living, page number 141. About who boast of the numbers of their care without being able to provide for them, page 194. About who leave their monasteries, page 196. Ignorance and illiteracy, page 201. The empty chatters of idleness to which we see present-day monastic cloister much addicted, page 206. And the prevalence of the work instead of faith. They cleaned the outside of the pot to dish but pay little heed to cleanliness inside, page 183. But as a logician he believed in the importance of clear thinking, and the Benedictine he taught that knowledge and understanding serves faith, not hindered it. For Bernard, the mystery of the faith transcends human knowledge and can be gained only through a mystic contemplation. He sees himself as the preacher with a search duty, a sacred duty duty to proclaim revealed truth and to defend it. For all his referring zeal, he stands against Abelard as a champion of tradition. He sees Abelard as a danger to the faith of young people and a simple man, and Abelard attempts to understand the Trinity as an evil example of intellectual arrogance, as an insult to Christian belief. So he can write that the mysteries of the God are forced open and deepest things Benedict about the discussion without reverence. Abelard sees this attack on discussion as unjustified and personal. Similar to this he suffered before. He maintained that he is defending Christian faith by making it intelligible as possible. He always believes that the words of the sacred scriptures and testimony of the Father must be true, but we must examine the evidence we have, often in the form of corrupt text and unreliable witnesses, to remove difficulties and contradictions. His famous Yes and No has been written with this purpose in mind, though more than anything it has given a false and damaging picture of him as a skeptic. There he had selected a set out 150 problems where there are conflicting authorities, no synthesis is offered nor conclusion drawing. It is a teaching manual designed for disruptions on the questions of manuscripts being faulty or misunderstood, prompted by the belief that by stating propositions and their opposites we can provoke inquiry and arouse at understanding. He says in his preface that this aim is to sharpen the wits of his young reader and incite them to seek for the truth. It would be equally wrong to suppose Abelard a rationalist in any but 12th century sense of wishing to his monastic logic for the better understanding of the faith. He witnessed sadly in his Confession of Faith. The earliest reference to contact between Abelard and Bernard is letter addressed to Bernard by Abelard when Bernard had visited the Paraclete soon after Alois was installed and before Abelard went to St. Gildas. He writes that on a recent visit to convent, Alois has told him that Bernard had stayed there. He had preached to the nuns like an angel. However, she had also informed him privately that Bernard had taken exception to their use of the Vulgate version of St. Matthew, which referred to transubstantial rather than daily bread in Lord's Prayer. The letter continues politely but firmly to defend Abelard's preference without yielding in an inch. We do not know Bernard's reaction. The two men met at the gathering at the Abbey of Morigny in 1131. Between 1132 and 38, Bernard was traveling in France, Italy and Germany, preaching on behalf of Pope Innocent II. During the period of papal schism, when many of the cardinals and important families in Italy recognized the rival claimants and Anacletus II. It was not until Anacletus died in 1138 that Innocent was able to live in Rome. He must have left France deeply grateful for Bernard's campaign to establish his legitimate claim. During this time, Abelard was probably teaching and certainly writing a great deal. After the burning of his book on Trinity 1121, he had started to rewrite and expand it in Theologia Christiana. He planned to comprehend theology in 3 parts. He also wrote his Ethica, that is Ethics of Scito, Known Yourself, a contemporary St. Paul's epistle to the Roman, and dialogue between philosophy and Jews and Christian, as well as hymn, sermon, answer to problem, and hexameron for the nuns of the Paraclete. At some date in 1139 or 1140, a copy of Abelard's Theologia was read by William and former abbot to St. Thierry in the Diocese of Reims, who had resigned to join remote Christian monastery at Signy in the Ardennes. He had known Abelard personally, perhaps when both had been students at Lyon, and he was close friend of Bernard. He was dismayed by what he read and by what he had heard of Abelard's teaching, new things which would endanger the faith. He listened 13 heretical points which he refutes, and sent the whole statement to Bernard and to Bishop Geoffrey of Chartres and papal legates in France at the time, who had supported Abelard's at the Council of Soissons 18 and 19 years previously. We do not know if Bishop replied, but Bernard acted at once. According to Bernard's biographer Geoffrey Auxerre, and other contemporary witness, Bernard twice met Abelard and suggested that he would modify his views and restrain his pupils, but to no effect. Bernard then approached first the Bishop of Sens and then Bishop of Paris to obtain permission to preach to the students. Abelard's reply seems to have been bring out 4th edition of the Theologia, unchanged in all essential. Bernard then appealed to the Pope, enclosing his treatise against Abelard's heresy, and he also wrote to the Cardinal at Rome. He links Abelard's name with the notorious annals of Bereskia, and his violent abuse and interpret language was startling, disagreeable to the unprejudiced readers. Abelard then asked Archbishop Henry of Sens to arrange for the meeting between himself and Bernard on the Sunday after a which should take the form of the public disputation on their disagreement. It was already to be great occasion. The relics of the cathedral were to be shown to Louis VII. He scored in the presence of the bishop and dignitaries of the diocese. Bernard at first refused to attend, and on the ground that he was no match for the skilled dialectician and disapproved of arguing about matters of the faith. His friends persuaded him to change his mind, so he proceeded to lobby in the bishop both by letter and meeting them at Sens to explain what he intended to do and to enlist their support. He also preached publicly to the people assembled in the town. In the letter addressed to his friends and pupils which Abelard wrote at the time, he made it clear that he looked upon Bernard's attack as yet another instance of misunderstanding and malice. At this time, from the monk who was greatly his inferior in intellectual capacity and training, he neither shared Bernard's burning conviction that was purity of the faith was jeopardized, nor was he likely to accept that he was a man who does not know his own limitations, making void the virtue of the gross by the cleverness of his words. He asked his friend to support him at the Council of Sens, and they must have been confident that the Bernard would be defeated in the promise of disputation. Instead, there was no disputation, but something much more like the Code of Inquisition, at which Bernard produced a list of to defend, renounce or deny that they were there. Abelard refused to make any statement on the grounds that he wished to appeal direct to the Pope and left the council. There had been much speculation. Why did he this so? He may have felt that this was going to be another council of Soissons, and that would not face it again, or that large social occasions which people like kings and council, Theobald and Champagne, present was no place of a subtle theological exposition, and that no one would pay proper attention. This seems like enough if we believe anything of the highly colored satirical account of the counsel given by Abelard's pupil, Berenger of Poitiers, who says that the bishops were half asleep and drunk after heavy meal, mumbling instead of we condemn. It has also been suggested that the Abelard has long suffered from a progressive form of cancer named as Hodgkin disease, that he had felt exhausted and ill and since, but he remained remission afterwards at Cluny. The council condemned 19 points in Bernard's statement as heretical, and Bernard sent off a letter describing proceedings to the Pope. The Archbishop of the Sens and Reims also wrote, and Bernard wrote again to the credentials. 6 weeks later, on 16 July, the Pope sent his rescript to the Archbishop and to Bernard, condemning Abelard as a heretic, excommunicating his followers, ordering his book to be burned and himself to be confined in a monastery in perpetual silence. The news reached Abelard at Cluny, where he had stopped on the long journey to Rome and stayed at the invitation of Peter the Venerable. Immediately after Council of Saints, or possibly just before, he had written to Confession of Faith addressed to Heloise, documents of great dignity and restraint, which was probably the last personal message she had from him. If we accept an earlier datings, Peter the Venerable has already written to the Pope, page number 215, to report that he and abbot of Citeaux had mediated between Abelard and Bernard, and the two men had met and were reconciled, and the letter asking permission of Abelard to remain as a monk of Cluny must be across the Pope's rescript. The sentence was afterwards lifted. Abelard died some month later in April 1142. Remember, this year Abelard died in April 1142, or perhaps in 1144. Peter the Venerable's letter to Heloise, page number 217, describing his death in a daughter's house of Cluny at Saint Markel near Chalon-sur-Saône, paid tribute to the simplicity and pity of his life, to his devotion to the studies, and as far as his health permitted. Right up to the end, it is uncertain if he actually wrote anything of Cluny at Saint Markel. The long, rather platitudinous letter in the verse-giving advice of his son Astrolabe is now generally dated about 1135 rather than to his periods. For the complete text, refer to the frequent complaints of our Heloise that she can have no hope of salvation if she cannot repent what she has once did with Abelard, and echoes of her second letter, page number 67 to 68. Abelard is not likely to have brought this up again some 6 years later. The dialogue between the philosopher and Jews and the Christian and the Oxymorons, which used to be considered late work and now ascribed at the mid-1130s, the short general confession of the faith to everyone, not one preserved by Bernard, Berenger of Poitiers, which was Abelard's personal defense, once have been written before the Council of Saints, and Apologia was planned. The lift, unfinished, perhaps broke off when Abelard heard of the Pope's sentence. There is no indication that he felt obliged to modify in theological views which he considered had been attacked in envy and ignorance, nor evidence that put into writing the pity of the humility to which Peter the Venerable testifies. He may well have been physically incapable of sustained creative efforts. Peter the Venerable is created with a somewhat pedestrian epithet of the described Abelard as the Socrates of the Gauls, Plato, and the West, our Aristotle, prince of scholar. The keen thinker and dialectician, whom his greatest victory when he renounced all the true philosophy of the Christ. One wonders that he had in mind deference to Socrates, another upon self-deception and loose thinking, who has been misrepresented as a corrupting influence on the minds of the young. 5 anonymous epithets are also preserved, all of which emphasize Abelard's fame as a philosopher and scholar without reference to their checkered career as a teacher of theology. There remains an exchange of letters between Heloise and Peter the Venerable, written something 1144, in which Heloise thanks Peter for visiting the Paraclete and burning with him Abelard's body in rest in the care of the community he had founded. She asked him for writing absolution for the Abelard to be hung over the tomb and for help in getting her son Astrolabe to benefice in one of the cathedral. Peter sends the absolution, page 228, along with the ratification of his verbal promise that Cluny will say 30 masses of the Heloise after her death and promise to do his best for Astrolabe. This is the only time Heloise mentioned him, and nothing defined is known about the young man who had played so small part in his parents' lives. Peter the Venerable died in 1156 to 1157, but Heloise outlived Abelard by some 21 years. Abelard by some 21 years, she is recorded in the necrology of the Paraclete as dying 16th May in 1163 or 64. The romantic had liked to think that she died like Abelard at the age of 63. In her competent hands of the Paraclete grew into be one of the most distinguished religious houses in France. 6 daughters' houses were founded during her lifetime to receive the increasing number of the postulants, and the cartulary of the convent of the Paraclete lists 29 documents which refer to the Paraclete when her care, confirming privileges and registering deeds of gift. 11 papal charters are among them. The one of the Pope of 1147 included Arabelle, meadows, wood, fish ponds, vineyards, farms, mills, teeths, and money. It is clear that Peter the Venerable, letter 200, page number 217, that Heloise was one of the church's greatest abbeys, revered for the sanctity as well as for her learning. It is impossible not to speculate about her inner thought and to wonder if she found her vocation, but of the course there can be no answer. Human love such as hers does not end with separation of or death of the beloved, but it changes in equality as the physical pangs of the severance are blunted. At least it seems unlikely that a woman of her character and common sense allowed herself of indulgence of brooding over the irrecoverable past. At higher level, one hoped that reconciliation with Abelard through their exchange of the letter made it impossible for her to love him on a different plans, and sisters in Christ at a lower level, that her fine intelligence and administrative ability found fully scope in what we should now call a rewarding career, and that passage of the time she achieved calm of the mind and all passion spent. Heloise is recorded in a Paraclete burial record as having been buried alongside Abelard in the Abbey Church, which was later known in the chapel of the Saint Denis or the Petit Monastery, little monastery. That was a small oratory built an Abelard student May year before to replace the simple reed, and that structure he had first set up. In 1497, the abbeys of the time had been bodies moved where was described as a damp and watery position and placed on either side of the high altar in a new oratory which had been built further away from the Arduson. They were moved again in 11 and 1621 to crypt below an altar on which stood a stone representing the 3 persons of the Trinity, which was believed to have been carved under Abelard's direction. In 1701, this stone was moved to a better position in the choir, and 1780 the bodies moved again in a new position, still in the crypt. When the convent was sold at the time of the Revolution and building demolished apart from the resistance of the abbeys at present Chetu, dating 1685, the bones were taken to the church of Saint Laurent in Nogent-sur-Seine, and 1800 to Paris, to Alexandria Leonoir's Muses de Monuments Francia. They were later moved to the cemetery of Mont-Louis, now Pierre Lachaise. There they still in the sarcophagus brought from Saint Marcel, where Lenoir believed to have been Abelard's original tomb. Beneath a Gothic-style structure and surrounded by the modern iron railing through which flowers are still sometimes placed beside their effigies by the tourist who knows something of their history, and Parisians and All Souls Day. There are relatively few tributes to Abelard after his death, either the as theologian or philosopher. People who remember of the years of the events at since knew little about nothing of Abelard's last months at Cluny. Bernard's influence was strong enough for Abelard's name to virtually erased, as if theological teachings continue in the cathedral school where Bernard's traditionalism were not acceptable. The analytical and critical methods of the influenced such famous theological manuals as Peter the Lombard's Book of the Sentence and Abelard stand as one of the creators of the open-minded thinking which led to the birth of the medieval universities. But as a logician, he suffered from the discovery of the Aristotle's scientific work with the decades of his death. Once Aristotle's solution to the nature of universal was known, Abelard's formulation of the conceptualism, which was remarkably Aristotelian, was no longer read. There are, however, manuscripts of the logical work and his Apologia, which dated back to the late 20th and early 13th century. The reference to the teaching, the case of the letter is very different. The occasional reference we have to lovers in the 20th century chronicles are short and factual. William Godel, a monk of St. Martin, the Limoges, writing in 1173, says that Heloise or Heloise was formerly Abelard's wife and truly his friend, and religious and learned woman well versed in both Latin and Hebrew. An allegorical poem highlighting Abelard's struggle with Bernard depicts Heloise searching for him in his time of crisis. And I read, "The bride then asked where is her Palatine, whose spirit showed itself totally divine. She asked why, like an exile, he had now withdrawn, he whom she had cherished at her breast." From the early 13th century, the chronicles of the tour described how Abelard had built the Paraclete and installed the nuns where with his former wife's Heloise as abbess, as she who was truly his love, and had brought their burial and prayed constantly for him after his death. And then adds, it is said that when she was laying in her last illness, she gave instructions that when she was dead, she should be laid down tomb of her husband. And when her dead body was carried to the open tomb, her husband, who had died long before, raised his arms to receive her and so clasped her close in her embrace. None of the nine known manuscripts of the letter can be dated before the late 13th century at the earliest. 150 years after the letters were written, there is no trace of independent manuscripts of Letter 1, Historia Calamitatum, a copy of which Heloise herself, page 47, says came into her hands. Jean de Meun must have had a manuscript when he translated the Historia and introduced the story of Abelard and Heloise into 64 lines of the continuation of the allegorical Roman de la Rose about 1200 AD. It seems probable, as both J. Monfrin and R.W. Southern have suggested, that the letters were kept by Heloise at the Paraclete, and more than a century after her death they were brought to Paris and copied. It would be unlikely that anyone would know of her revelations during her lifetime. Peter the Venerable would hardly have thought so highly of her holiness and sense of occasion had he read of her sensual longings and self-reproach of hypocrisies. There seems no reason to support that Heloise edited the personal letter in any way, even if we accept that Abelard may have put words into her mouth in Historia Calamitatum. My own feeling is that once she had accepted that her relationship with Abelard must be re-established on a different basis, that henceforth she could look to him only for guidance as the founder of the institution which she was respected abbess. She would be unwilling to read those painful outpourings of her heart from her first paragraph of letter 6. Correspondence takes on a different tone from Heloise. Never wavers. What became Abelard's copies of the letter no one can know. It was current practice of the medieval writers to keep copies of their own letters and even to revise them for later circulation as a letter collection. This would be of general interest as showing and learning and expertising in the art of letter writing of a single individual, such as St. Bernard, Peter the Venerable, or John of Salisbury, and its importance would be literary rather than historical. With the younger Pliny or Pseudonius Apollinaris as model for the variety of content and elegance of the style. It was unusual for the answer to be included. They could disturb the literary unity of the collection. Here is further indication that the letters were not issued either in Alyos's lifetime or later as literary letter collection, but for their intrinsic personal interest when they came to light in the late 13th century. Even after Jean de Meun, reference remains scanty. Abelard and Alyos are not among the incontinent lover in the second circle of the Dante's Inferno, Canto 5, though their story had something in common with the death of Paolo and Francisca de Rimini. Chaucer does not more than mention Heloise, that was a base net furno prayers in the wife of Bath's prologue, line number 677 to 78, where she is one of the oddly assorted company in a satire and a matrimony. He probably knew of her through the Roman de la Rose. The first genuine interest in the lovers was shown by Petrarch. One of the 9 Goths manuscripts dating from the early 14th century belonged to him, and the marginal Latin notes in the Historia Calamitatum and personal letters are believed to be in his hand. It is certainly understandable that the author of the Secretum and of his own intensely personal letters should have read the manuscripts closely, but as a century later, 1461, Francois Villon included these lines in his ballad De Dems du Temp Jadis, his theme being the death is inevitable for all mankind. Where is this learned lady Heloise, for whose sake Prior Abelard was first castrated, then become a monk at St. Denis? It was through love that he suffered and such misfortune. But where are last year's snows? But this amount to so little, especially at the time when romances like that of the Tristan and Isolde of Accusation and Nicolette were highly popular, that it seems likely that the Abelard and Alois could not be fitted into the current ideal of courtly love, with its emphasis on the lover's devotion to the chaste and unattainable lady. Abelard and Alois speaks in a different language of the sensuous frankness and pagan realism in love and classical stoic fortitude in adversity. The relationship found physical expression, and Aloysia is neither cold nor remote but loving and generous, eager to give services and not to demand it. By contrast with the cruel reality of the tragedy, courtly love as depicted in the romance of the chivalry appear mannered and artificial. The Latin text of the letter of the Abelard's major work was printed for the first time in Paris 1616 in 2 practical identical editions, one of the Francois de Amboise and other of the Andre Duncan's. Why there are 2 editions in the never been explained. The introductory material in the 2 different, but the text is the same, and the noted on letter by Duchens appear in both. This text remains standard for over 2 centuries. In 1718, Richard Rawlinson brought out in London a new edition of the letter which added nothing to the edition of 1616, and 1841 John Caspar O'Reilly of Zurich published Historia and the 4th person letter. This was followed by 1849 by the Victor Cousin's Patry Abelard opera in 2 volumes published in Paris, which became the standard edition. It includes Duchen's note, and the text is based on D. Amboise plus Quinchin's reading of the 4 manuscripts. It is generally considered a better text than of J.P. McGain in volume 178 of his Patrologia Latina 1855, though this too is mainly of D. Amboise's text with Duchen's notes. Today, the best edition of the purpose of the citation is by Eric Hicks Levy, Pierre Abelard, Paris and Geneva. This printed Latin text of the letter 1 and 7 with the numbered lines in parallel with the French translation attributed to Jean de Meun, later 8, Abelard's Rule of Aloysius and Nuns, and has been edited by T.P. McLaughlin, Abelard's Rule of Re-Religion, Women Medieval Studies, without numbered lines. And D. Amboise Duchin's text of the English edition by the Rawlinson gave rise to an extraordinary number of the translation and romantic paragraphs of the letter. The best translation were the English one by Reverend Joseph Brington, London 1787, and the French version of Dom Gervaist, Paris 1723, but these were less influential than some of the wilder fights of the Frenzy 1687, Roger D. Rabutin, and later Heloise's two love letters and Abelard's reply to the first, in which he had asserted fictitious incidents and reduced the whole story of the contemporary flirtatious intrigue. This continued to be reprinted until the mid-19th century. Another version, paraphrased by Version Hans and printed Amsterdam. So the fourth edition of this 1722 was reprinted in 1900 by J.M. Dent in the Temple Classic series of the love letters of Abelard and Heloise, and ran successfully through the 10th edition until it went out of print in 1945. It is edited by Miss H. Morton, who tells us in her short preface that it is rather a paraphrase than a translation. By the swiftness and sympathy best gives the spirit of the age of original. Historia Calamitatum, headed Abelard's to Philintus, opens thus. And it also goes on. Heloise is given a maid servant's agaton. She was brown, well-shaped, and a person superior in her rank. Her features were regular and her eyes sparkling, fit to raise love in any man whose heart was possessed by another possession. So also have a singing master who was exceptionally qualified for conveying a billet and greatest dexterity and secrecy. And Abelard's sister Lucilla is persuaded to support her argument against marriage. Typical of what flown from Heloise's pen is followed passages from the letter too. In 1925, the letters of Abelard and Heloise, translated by C.K. Scott, Moncrief. You remember this name? 1925, the letters of Abelard and Heloise, translated by C.K. Scott, Moncrief, C.K.Scott, Scott, Moncreiff. Translators from the McGain's text was published by Cambridge University Press, edition limited, 750 copies, and now out of print. Scott Moncrief quotes from the Hughes translation, but evidently know nothing of the Bringtons, as he claimed to be the first to translate the Latin and not to adopt the base France version. There are no explanatory note, and the introduction only curious and rather factitious change of the letters, with George Moore querying the authenticity of the letters. Moore's novels Heloise and Abelard had appeared in 1921. Now remember, another writer, Moore, M-O-O-R-E-S novel, Heloise and Abelard. It was appeared in 1921. The style of the translation is idiosyncratic to the point of being sometimes barely intelligible. It wavers uneasily between the cadences of the authorized version, the letter transcription of the original letter, sentence and structure, and under-punctuated sentences of Moore himself. Here is a phrase and Heloise's first letter. So there are the novel written by Moore, and the name of the novel is Heloise and Abelard. No other English translation has appeared since 1925, though there is no lack of interest in the human tragedy of the lovers and growing one, Abelard, and as a logician. George Moore's novel was followed by Helen Waddell's popular Peter Abelard, and later by Mr. Worthington, The Three Immortal Lovers. No other English translation has appeared since 1925, though there is no lack of interest in the human tragedy of lovers and a growing one in Abelard as a logician. George Moore's novel as followed by Helen Waddell's popular Peter Abelard, and later by M. Worthington, The Immortal Lovers in 1970 by Ronald Miller's play, which ran successfully in the West End. Abelard and Heloise do not write in the unsophisticated Latin of the previous century, and they have not the easy grace of an accomplished letter writer such as Peter the Venerable. The composition and style of their letter follows the rules of correct letter writing of the 12th century. The elegance those sought, informal address, proper choice of words, and arrangements of material seems to us excessive. And Scott Moncrieff has shown that the frequent use of the correct connecting relative pronouns and elaborate antithesis of the clauses have to be eschewed in translation. Abelard's Historia Calamitatum, being largely narrative, is less rhetorical, and Heloise can write directly in her personal letters. But it was the convention of that day to overload a reasoned argument with strings of the strokes, quotations from the vulgate and Christian fathers, or to introduce a homely or an appropriate topic which reads like a set piece. Heloise, for example, has said something in letter 6 about the evil of incontinence and the effect of the strong drink, page 99, which Abelard elaborates in letter 8, repeating the same quotation. In addition, their intense classical education leaves its mark both in quotation and choice of words. In this sense, they are both learned clerks and writes in mood of literary showmanship. But they are also individuals who would be exceptional in any age, whose letter move through the widest range of emotion, devotion, disappointment, grief and indignation, self-confidence, ambition, impatience and self-approach and resignation, all under the discipline of the keen critical intelligence which is in mark in Heloise as in Abelard. They deserve to be heard, even if imperfectly, at the second hand through a translation in the words they wrote.